In 1845, a two-ship expedition set out on a voyage to the frozen Canadian archipelago with the goal of finding a passage that would serve as a shortcut connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Shortly after the voyage began, 5 crew members became ill, and the ship's captain was forced to abandon them in Greenland. So, these 5 were the only survivors of the expedition. Before we start, just like the video if you liked it, and let's go. With the beginning of the 19th century and the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and especially with the advent of steam engines, explorers had covered almost all parts of the Earth in 1945, with the exception of the coastline, which is about 2,600 kilometers long in the Canadian Arctic. During this period, England and other great powers were trying to expand their influence everywhere in the world by sea. But the continents of the Americas represented a natural sea barrier for them, and the expedition would go a long way around South America, or the second route from the other side of the world. In both cases, the road is long and arduous. So finding a shortcut to the journey from England to China was the most important goal of the Royal Navy at the time, to increase trade profits. And in the middle of the 19th century, the Royal Navy made a final attempt after many attempts before that had failed. It launched a very difficult and dangerous voyage whose goal was to go west towards Lancaster Strait and then head south for a distance of about 1,600 kilometers. The first choice to lead the expedition fell on Sir William, who reached the furthest point in the North Pole in 1827, but William refused to lead the expedition and said that he was satisfied with Arctic trips. The second option was Sir James Clark, who led 6 expeditions to the North Pole and 1 to the South Pole, but he also refused to go on this trip and said that he promised his wife that he would not go on any dangerous trip to the North Pole again. The third choice was a young commander named James Fiddes, who was 31 years old. He joined the Navy when he was 12 years old and rose through the ranks quickly because of his intelligence and boldness. However, despite his agreement to lead the expedition, the ship's crew refused to let this young man be the leader of the expedition, under the pretext that he did not have sufficient experience. Finally, the choice fell on Sir John Franklin, 59 years old, who participated in many battles, the most famous of which were the French Revolutionary War and the Napoleonic War. And he led 2 expeditions to the North Pole, but he became famous because of the copper mine expedition in 1819, which failed miserably and resulted in the death of 11 out of 20 of its expeditions. And they had eaten the leather of their shoes due to extreme hunger. So, although he is a good person and cares a lot about his crew, after the incident, he became famous as the Shoe Eater. And this trip was a golden opportunity for him to correct the mistake of the past, so he agreed to lead the expedition. The Royal Navy finally settled on Sir John Franklin as the first commander of the expedition, Irishman Francis Crozier as the second commander, who will command the ship HMS Terror, and James Whichams, the third commander, who will command the ship HMS Erebus. The ships were Heckler-class combat ships, specially modified for Arctic expeditions, crewed by 67 sailors. It was equipped with a 25-horsepower steam engine capable of propelling the ship at a speed of 8 kilometers. In addition to the copper propellers attached to the engine, the crew can dismantle them and pull them inside the ship's hull to protect them from ice. On May 19, 1845, the expedition, consisting of 134 people, set off with supplies sufficient for all members of the journey for 3 years, 2 tons of tobacco, 7,500 liters of alcoholic beverages, a library containing 200 books, and finally, 16,000 cans of preserved food. So we can say that these ships were like space shuttles for that time. First, the expedition moved from London north to Scotland, and then crossed the Atlantic Ocean to the Whaling Islands on the west coast of Greenland. But before the expedition arrived in Greenland, 5 crew members became ill and withdrew from the trip, and we can say that God had destined a new life for them, as these 5 were the only survivors of this expedition. On July 12, 1845, the expedition completed its journey with 129 people, and 2 weeks later, a group of whalers saw them in Baven Bay, and this was the last time anyone saw this expedition. Sailing in the Arctic is very slow, because the canals and waterways are filled with ice and ships keep pushing giant blocks of ice to get them out of the way. Therefore, in the first year, the expedition covered only about 800 kilometers as they circled Cornwallis Island, and when they did not find any passage in this place, they were forced to return to Beechy Island with the onset of winter, meaning it is only about 350 kilometers away from Beefan Bay, the point from which they started. However, they considered the first year a good achievement because they made sure there were no corridors there. Because the sea becomes frozen in the Arctic winter, the expedition took refuge in a small bay between Beech Island and Devon Island. They lowered the sails and covered the entire ship from above with a cloth cover. Then they surrounded the sides of the ship with ice, which created a warm atmosphere for them to spend the winter there. And during this winter, 3 crew members died and were buried on Beachy Island, their bodies remaining intact for more than a century due to the ice. So they were found in the 1980s, and after examination, it was found that the cause of death was tuberculosis. Even the 5 men who withdrew from the mission were found to be infected with tuberculosis, which means that this disease was already widespread among the members of the mission from the beginning, and at that time, there was no vaccine for this disease. In the spring, the ships were freed from the ice and the expedition began its journey south towards the island, which was then known as King William's Land. It is an area of land on the edge of the areas discovered at the time, and no one knew that it was an island. When they reached the crossroads at William Sound Island, Franklin had 2 choices: head south and hope it was already an island and cross down, or head west and hope they could find a shortcut before winter came. But Franklin decided to head straight west, and this was the biggest mistake of his life. The area they entered is located west of King William Island, and it is the most dangerous water in the entire region, because it was surrounded by many water channels that flowed into it at the same time, in addition to the accumulation of ice in huge quantities in these waters. While trying to get out of this predicament, their ships froze near the west coast of King William Island, and they were forced to spend the winter there from 1946 to 1947, and hence was the beginning of the end, as that period was one of the coldest years ever in the Arctic. During the long winter, the ship Terror sank in the ice, so the ship's crew moved to Erebus' ship. As for the ship Terror, they made it a refrigerator for the bodies of their colleagues, which began to increase day after day, because the lead used in closing the food containers leaked into the food and contaminated it, causing food poisoning for many crew members. In 11/6/1847, Captain John Franklin died, and at the beginning of 1848, the British Navy launched a campaign to search for the missing expedition, led by Sir James Ross, who initially refused to lead the expedition because he was newly married and promised his wife that he would not go on a dangerous journey. After 18 months of siege due to the snow, Captain Kruger, who took command after the death of Captain Franklin, decided to abandon the ships and try to return on foot. So they put small boats on sledges, put all their needs on them, and began their journey to the south. During their journey on foot, they passed piles of stones, in which they placed some messages at the beginning of the journey, stating that they were fine. They changed it with new letters, on which they wrote that the ship Terror and the ship Erebus were abandoned 30 kilometers northwest of this point, after being stuck in the ice for 18 months. And the expedition now consists of 105 members, led by Sir Kruger, and the total deaths so far are Captain Franklin, 9 officers, and 15 crew members, signed by James Fitzjames, captain of the Erebus. Then they continued their journey on foot, pulling sleds weighing more than 3 tons in freezing temperatures, and most of them were suffering from general weakness due to malnutrition. So if someone got tired and couldn't walk, they would leave him in a tent with some canned food, plus a desperate promise that they would come back to him one day. But before they reached the river, something strange happened that caused the members of the expedition to separate from each other. The reason has not been discovered yet, but what is certain is that more than 20 bodies were found along the coast of King William Island, in more than 12 different places. In 1850, a group of Inuit people found an abandoned ship with a group of men dead in their beds, which was later confirmed to be the Erebus ship. The Eskimo people added horrifying testimonies that they found a mass grave containing more than 30 bodies with signs of dismemberment, which indicates that the members of the expedition were eating their colleagues after their death. But the British Navy completely rejected the idea and said that the Inuit people were just savages and liars. On March 31st, 1854, the British Navy announced that all members of the expedition had died while performing their service. 145 years after the beginning of the research, the biggest shock occurred. The last expedition camp was found on the island, and after examining the bodies, they confirmed that the expedition ate the flesh of its dead colleagues, as they found human bone remains with a cut mark indicating that someone had tried to extract marrow from the bones. And finally, in 2014, the wreck of HMS Erebus was found, and 2 years later, the Terror ship was found in Terror Bay, which was named in honor of the ship before it was discovered there that it had sunk. As for the Northwest Passage, one of the strange ironies in this case is that one of the ships led by Robert McClure found the Northwest Passage. And here the story ends, so like the video and subscribe if you like this type of content.